I don't know if you all saw this report, but Brian, and I think all of you have made points to this, but on Business Insider, recently there was this, I think, a really interesting read about how the counteroffensive is raising doubts about whether U.S. and Western militaries are training their troops for the right kind of war. And this kind of gets into what all of you have been saying. And that gets me to the question, if now the Westminster mainstream media is talking more about how even NATO itself would not fight a war like this in Ukraine if it were, if it were to put itself in Ukraine's shoes. I think that goes against the fact that Ukraine is literally being pushed and funded and armed to do this kind of war. But at any event, there seems to be this walking back. But if this is the case, then what does, if the United States is at the head of NATO, and we're talking about the United States, the EU, the NATO countries, minus a few in NATO, are all wondering about their capabilities with Ukraine, then what is the future of this conflict, and also just of NATO in general? If they truly can't fight this kind of war, then how can they even expect to do anything whatsoever with regard to Russia and China? Because to me, it seems like politically this and militarily, neither is really feasible. But maybe your reactions to that, whoever wants to jump in.
The military aspect, again, even these small wars the United States was fighting around the globe, they had this initial success in Iraq back in the 1990s, and then again in the early 2000s. They had this initial success because there was this disparity technologically between their military and the rest of the world's. But even in Iraq, we watched that shed. And then in 2006, the Israeli war with Lebanon, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, they carried out this massive air campaign. They were running out of bombs. They needed the U.S. to send emergency provisions to them. And then they sent ground troops in, and they were turned back by Hezbollah, because already at that point, these irregular forces were getting their hands on military technology that put them on par with a force, say, like Israel or like the United States. So this is why the U.S. found itself in these quagmires in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Syria. And in a very similar way, that was the problem in Vietnam. Even though the U.S. had this massive military machine, people might not realize this. They lost over 10,000 aircraft because Vietnam was getting, at that time, modern air defense technology. So this is the problem the U.S. has. Their small wars don't work anymore, and they don't even have the capability of fighting a large-scale war, which, as all of us have talked about many, many times, requires a massive industrial base, which the U.S. and Europe don't have. And since the beginning of the special military operation, because they put their sanctions on Russia and they've denied Europe access to cheap energy, it's going to be even harder to create that industrial base that they need. Meanwhile, Russia and China have this massive head start, and that the title of the article was something like, the U.S. isn't training their forces for the right war yet. They're not training their forces, they're not equipping their forces, and their military industrial base is not prepared for the right conditions to sustain and win in modern combat these days.
Yeah, this is absolutely correct. And can I just say, this isn't new. This is something that has happened before. It happened to the British Empire. The British Empire in the 19th century, its armed forces atrophied because they weren't fighting against peer opponents. They were fighting the equivalent of local wars. They were fighting local wars every year, continuously. The idea that the British Empire was a peaceful, quiet empire, completely wrong. But eventually, the British military became reconfigured for this. The Royal Navy gradually lost its edge. The British Army absolutely lost its edge. And then when the First World War began, they found themselves very short, and they had to change things very, very fast. And they were lucky that they had strong allies and could find the time and the space to do that. So this isn't a new problem. It is what empire, one of the things empire does to you. If you have militaries that are there to act as a kind of power projection type force to maintain your control in all sorts of places, as against a military that is there to defend your country, then your military will evolve in a particular direction. I don't think the United States has any solution to this problem. The British began to understand before the First World War that there were problems with their militaries, and there were lots of attempts at reform and changes in the military. And to be said straightforwardly, the British political and military leadership of that era were far more capable and intelligent and forceful people than the United States, than you find in the United States today. There is no American equivalent to people like Kitchener and Fisher, for example, that you had in Britain at that time. So what I think is going to happen is the Americans are going to say to themselves, well, this is a war against a peer competitor. It's an industrial war. There's going to be an awful lot of talk, great deal of discussion. Lots of articles are going to be written about the training being wrong, about the need to build up the industrial base and all that. And nothing will happen because there are far too many people who want to leave things as they are. And besides, changing the configuration of the US armed forces would put in question the whole operation of the US armed forces up to this point. You have an army, a military that is focused on fighting peer competitors and defending your homeland and your home base. Then, of course, you're no longer going to have an imperial military anymore, which is really configured to go around and, chase people in mountains in Afghanistan or occupy places in eastern Syria or do those sort of things. So I don't personally think there's going to be any sign of reform. It's the same with everything else that happens in the United States. An awful lot of money is going to be thrown at this problem, but there's not going to be very much coming out the other end.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're going to throw more money at it. They're going to take the same solution that they use with the EU. They're just going to transfer it over to NATO, which is more EU. They're going to say more NATO. They're going to try to grow NATO. They're going to throw more money at NATO. They're going to tell countries to raise their percentage budget that goes into NATO. They got Finland. They're going to push to get Sweden. They're going to look to get Moldova, and they're just going to try to expand NATO, throw more money at NATO, increase the budgets of NATO. That's going to be their answer to whatever problems they're having. That's the way they always go about solving these types of situations. Instead of taking the advice of what Brian is saying and just pausing, stop, maybe even scale back and rethink things. No way. They can't admit that they're losing. They can't admit that they've been defeated. They can't admit that maybe things have changed and we have to kind of look at things in a different way. The world is changing. They can't do it. They are just going to pour more and more money into this. If this was a business, this business is about to go bust. If this was being run in a smart way, if this was a business that was being run in a smart way and they saw competitors and they saw that the market had changed, that business would take a pause. It would stop. It would take a look at what's going around, take a look at its staffing, take a look at its management, take a look at its products and reconfigure. That's not what they're going to do. They're just going to print more money. They're going to force more countries, all the countries in Europe, which don't have the money, don't have the budgets, they're going to force them to pay more into the NATO pot. And the whole thing is just going to go belly up. When is it going to go belly up? 5, 10, 20 years? I don't know, but that's where it's heading.
Well, perhaps now we can pivot to some World War II revisionism, which I feel like is a huge theme over the last several weeks. There was, of course, the just multitudinous embarrassment in Canadian Parliament, the literal honoring of the NAZI, Mr. Yaroslav Hunka, which is probably the international scandal of the year, and if not, Canada's history. But then you also had even smaller examples of this. So recently you had Antony Blinken take to Twitter, where he often gets what they call ratioed, for those who don't know, just immense amounts of replies and quote tweets as applied as in contrast to those who actually like what he's saying. But he said on Twitter 82 years ago, Nazis murdered 34,000 Jews at Babin Yar. Soviets buried this history, which today Putin's government manipulates to cover for Russia's abuses. Now, people on Twitter were not very happy. You had Dmitry Polanski, the UN permanent representative for Russia, respond. But the overall objection to this was, well, the massacres that occurred at Babin Yar were done by, yes, Germany's Nazi forces and their Ukrainian collaborators. This is located, of course, in what is present-day Kiev, and that many people were killed, not just the 34,000 Jews, but also you had 150,000 total people during this occupation, many of which were Soviet prisoners of war, communists, Romanis. We can go on and on and on. But the point is then you had, even in that short video that we played here of Lindsey Graham talking about World War II, that this is World War II. Did you watch it, World War II? Because we know where this is going. But yet, what I'm just wondering your reactions to in your commentary on all of this, because first, I haven't heard World War II in a while be referenced in relation to this conflict, but it seems at this stage there's more and more bluster about it, and it really is blowing back in the face. But I think it needs to be talked about because it's really important and really dangerous the way that the United States and its Western allies, and I'll get into what Baerbock said at the EU foreign ministers meeting too, but maybe your initial reactions to this before we get to that.
I don't want to get your channel demonetized, so I will refer to them as World War II era Germany. The West has had a huge problem even before World War II. Their relationship with that German government, and then even at the end of World War II, I think it was the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill who was even contemplating siding with Germany against the Soviet Union. They said, well, look, we defeated Germany. Let's just have them pivot back against the Soviet Union and we will work with them. And at that time, there were people who said, no, we're not going to do that. But then all of the nations in the collective West grabbed up all of the German scientists, politicians, military leaders that they didn't put on trial. And they put them in charge of spearheading an anti-Soviet project that would continue to operate throughout the Cold War and even up to and including today. So the problems that we see, the extremists we see running around Ukraine today, they have a direct lineage all the way back to World War II, and then this post-World War II Cold War project that the West, including the US and also Canada and the UK, that they were running to use these extremists against the Soviet Union. And then after that, Russia. We saw the same thing with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They used them against various nations they targeted, not just in North Africa and the Middle East, but also China. They were using these groups to target China and countries in Asia. So they've always had a huge problem. Even in the U.S. military, I was in the U.S. military. There were far too many people who had an unhealthy obsession or admiration for World War II era Germany. And I was just showing people on my channel, there's this documentary on TV in the US, and General McMaster was about the Battle of 73 Easting during the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s. And he was talking about how they defeated the Iraqis, and they had this Iraqi officer, and they put him in the back of the Bradley. And he said, hey, why do you have a picture of this, your enemy from World War II? It was General Rommel. a picture of General Rommel in a U.S. Bradley in Iraq. And he said, well, maybe if you studied him, you wouldn't be sitting in the back of my Bradley. And he said we modeled ourselves after him. So they just think about how big of a problem this has been all throughout since the end of World War II. And remember, they did not beat the Iraqis in 1991 or 1991. They did not beat them because they were master tacticians. They beat them because Iraqis had no night vision. They had old rusty tanks, and they weren't trained properly, and they were getting blown up before they could even get into their tanks. It wasn't because they were outmaneuvering the Iraqis. So this has always been a problem. Maybe Alexander and Alex can elaborate even deeper into this.
I think one of the fundamental problems that a lot of people of a certain political viewpoint have in the West about the Second World War is that, of course, the country that made the biggest contribution to the Allied victory into the Second World War was Russia, or at any rate, the Soviet Union. And this is a very embarrassing and very difficult fact. I mean, it is also, by the way, a fact that if you're talking about the places where the Holocaust took place, those places where the Holocaust took place were liberated by the Soviet army. They ended, in effect, what was going on in these places. In fact, they did end. It did end what was going on in these places. Now, this is very difficult, given that they are the adversary today, and it's become even more difficult given the politics of Ukraine. And again, we're going to have to be careful what we say, but I think we all understand what I mean. So the result is that you're having all these extraordinary, elaborate historical contortions. Now, what Blinken was referring to with Babi Yar is a controversy that actually existed within the Soviet Union itself, because the Soviets most definitely did commemorate what happened at Babi Yar, this massacre there. But following Soviet policies of that period, they didn't differentiate nationalities. And that didn't make it clear that most of the people who were killed in Babi Yar were Jews. Now, this was criticized at that time within the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet poet Yevtushenko wrote a poem about it, which Shostakovich, the composer, actually incorporated in his 13th symphony, of which, by the way, there is a Soviet recording. So this was a discussion that took place in the Soviet Union at that time. But of course, they did acknowledge what actually happened at Babi Yar. Blinken's attempt to try to change the story, to make it seem as if it was suppressed, is, well, I mean, it's mendacious. It is playing with facts. And this is what we're seeing all the time about the Second World War. So there's a huge effort to write the Soviets out of any account of what happened in the war in Europe. There is an equally strenuous effort to write the Chinese out of what happened in the war in the Pacific. Very few people actually know much about the fact that for most of the Second World War, the bulk of the Japanese army was fighting China. It wasn't fighting the United States at all. And at the same time, we have to trot out all these historical parallels, all these bad historical parallels from the Second World War in ways that make it look like we are still waging the Second World War against all these terrible people in Beijing and Moscow and wherever. We make all these false analogies. But in order to make those analogies stick, we have to go back and change the account of what actually happened. So I think it's very sinister in every respect, one of the most sinister things that has happened, given that the Second World War is still the single greatest and most tragic event of modern history. To actually start tampering with the history of that period, to try to sort of misrepresented in this way in order to advance current political points, that is straight out of Orwell, and it is straight out of 1984, and in ways that I once would never have imagined.
Yeah. Rewrite the history of World War II, erase the fact that Russia played the most significant role in defeating NAZI Germany. You got to erase that. You then got to make Russia into the villain. They were the villain of World War II. Thus, they're the villain today. That's what they're saying. And take a look at when this rewriting of history began. This is not a coincidence. This is deliberate. And every one of the collective West leaders, the ones that are very much invested in Project Ukraine, they've been told that they need to incorporate some World War II revision in their speeches, in their interviews. Boris Johnson, 2 weeks ago, he kicked it off. He said that Britain won World War II with the help of Ukraine. The next day, Ursula gives a speech to the Atlantic Council, her fellow, globalist warmongers. So she's speaking to the crowd, right? And she says that she doesn't mention what the U.S. did in Hiroshima. That didn't happen. But a bomb was dropped. And oh, by the way, Russia, we got to prevent Russia from doing it again. Nuclear threats, we can't let it happen again. Implying, she didn't come out directly and say it was Russia that dropped the bomb in Hiroshima, but everyone understood her connection, what she was trying to say. And then comes Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau, well, he got the memo about this rewriting of World War II, and Trudeau said, I'm going to top all of these guys. They're talking about Hiroshima. Boris Johnson is giving an interview in the UK media. I'm going to bring a real life living NAZI. And I'm going to bring it to Parliament, and everyone's going to clap. And that's exactly what happened. And this guy's been to Parliament before. He's been honored before. Everyone knew who this guy was. He had a meeting with Zelensky and Trudeau a couple of hours before the event even kicked off. We all know this. And so you had what happened in Canada. A couple of days later, Blinken tweets out this, what you just read, Danny, about Babin Yar. He tweets it out. Everyone is asking, what is this guy doing? What is he talking about? People are saying, but he tweeted it out. I haven't seen him retract it. I haven't seen him delete that tweet. I haven't seen him say I messed up. Nope. He just goes on about his day. And yesterday, Ben Wallace, in the interview with The Telegraph, what does he say? He says that Ukraine needs to mobilize its youth just like Britain did in 1939 and 1941, just like Britain did in World War II. So I think you're going to be hearing a lot more of the collective West leaders trying to make this connection between World War II, Project Ukraine, but Russia was the villain then, and Russia is the villain today. So give Ukraine more money.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.